Hello and good evening. My name is Lynn Camerlin from Uppsala University in the Young Academy of Europe. And we're here tonight with Professor Lourdes Benería, an eminent economist and an emerita professor of city and regional planning at Cornell University. Hello, Lourdes, and thank you so much for being here this evening.
Thank you for having me.
I'm a great fan of your work. I think you've made tremendous contributions. And I wanted to interview you today because I was really inspired by the talk you gave in Barcelona in March for International Women's Day. So this made me really feel like I'd like to know more about you and basically what makes you you. And so I'd like to start a bit from the basics. You mentioned in March that you grew up in the Pyrenees.
I grew up in the, what we call here Central Pyrenees, which is where the highest mountains are, near the peak of Aneto, which is the highest mountain in the Pyrenees. So very narrow valleys. I was born in a small village. At that time it probably had 300 inhabitants, and now it may have 150 in the wintertime, many more people in the summertime. And I was born there in 1937 when there were no roads in the valley. I still remember the first time I saw a car. I was 5 years old. And we went to the nearest town where there were cars and buses by horse, which is, my father had horses. And we went by horse, and then it was the first time, then the feeling of getting into a car and seeing those, for the first time, seeing those trees coming towards me. It seemed like the trees were coming towards me, not that we were moving. And it was a very strange feeling. I remember it so vividly. I guess there are not many people in Spain that grew up without, at first at least, without seeing a car. I was not even aware of the sound of motors, you know, a motor. There were no tractors in the valleys of the Pyrenees. It was a self-contained economy, you know, subsistence economy. Most of the valleys were the closest one, the highest ones. And when I've been in the third world or in many developing countries, when we talk about the subsistence economy, I often have thought, well, yes, I lived it. I lived this when I was a kid. Now the valleys are very globalized. Tourism, ski, local agriculture is gone. They only have now the gardens that people, you know, the vegetables that they grow for self-consumption. And that's all there is. Yeah, no more wheat, no more, not even potatoes, unless it's in the backyard. All of this is gone. The local economy that I saw is gone. And so I have seen these transitions. I have lived through these transitions that we see in many developing countries now, where the local agriculture gets swallowed up by the forces, economic forces that come from outside. And in many ways, you know, my valley is one of the valleys that has the most beautiful. It was declared UNESCO's, how you say in English?
World Heritage Site?
Yes, because it has 8 beautiful Romanesque churches in a small space, or a small valley. It's a small valley, and they are very beautiful. 12th, 13th centuries. One of them even goes back to the 11th century. And they are really magnificent. And that is what has attracted also, apart from the beautiful landscape, many tourists, and is now, you know, globalized, very different valley. So in many ways I've thought that I've gone from I remember once in New York City, when I lived in New York, we had a women's group. And one of the things we had to do to introduce ourselves was to talk about our background. And people would say, well, I'm from a working class family, I am from a middle class family, describing. And when my turn came, I said, you know, I am medieval. I come from a medieval background. It was not working class, it was not upper class or middle class, it was medieval. And transformed very quickly, but that is part of my background. Is that what you wanted to hear?
What were your family like? Do you have siblings?
Yeah, I was the youngest of 6, and by a big difference. Yeah, my family was, you know, a fairly conservative family who had some land, but not much. I mean, if my family was relatively well-to-do, it had to do with more with the different things that my father, in a way, was like a jack of all trades. You know, doing. He had horses and would transport tourists that left their car wherever they had to stop and then go through the valley with horses, or he also traded with different animals such as sheep and cows, and the sheep meant that he bought wool from the sheep valley and sold it somewhere else. You know, these different things. He had different things to do, and that's what my family was like. It was not a typical, not a peasant family, as we would say, because it was most of the whatever the family had to do had different sources, and so that's why it was difficult for me to define clearly, my background.
And your mother was a housewife?
My mother, yes, she came more from a more traditional family that had land. And it was from a different village, a beautiful house that was, we have photos of it, built in the 16th century. So that was that was not the case with my father. My father's father was an orphan, and he grew up with an aunt, and probably we think that the family and the name Benería came from the Pyrenees, but more to the west, the part that is not Catalonia anymore. But we're not sure about that.
And your life, of course, took a very different trajectory because you went to the big city and you got a PhD. Is there a precedent, or are you the first PhD in your family?
I think I'm the first PhD, but there were precedents of siblings that studied. One of my sisters was a teacher. The other one was what we call here pharmacist, which is not the same as in English. I mean, here a pharmacist is someone who studies the same amount of time and different topics as doctors. She is considered to be like a doctor. And these were my precedents. The rest of the siblings did not go through university. But I was the one who was more determined to do it, even though I was the youngest. I'm not sure I was the youngest. I don't think my parents had destined for me to go to the university. But I wanted to go, so they let me.
And what kind of, was that a fight, or did you
No,
have
it was not a fight,
that?
but I do remember saying to my, because when I told my father I wanted to move on to university when I finished high school, he said, why? You're going to get married, you can help me with different things, and you don't need to go to university. And I said, no, I do want to go. But my father died a year later. I don't know what would have happened if he had lived. He might have said, there's no need for you to go to university. I don't know. But he had died. My mother said, fine. And in the traditional Pyrenees Mountains, it's the oldest brother they inherited. It's a primogeniture system. So the oldest brother was the one who had to pay the bills.
Yep.
So, and he said, fine. Or at least he said, okay. I'm not sure it was so fine, but but I went to university and I did economics, which was very unusual, and nobody understood what is this economics. It was the first year that the University of Barcelona had economics. They had just, that's why I did so, because I saw it in the paper. I didn't know what to study, and I was very unsure. And all I was sure that I didn't want to do pharmacy because all the women went in that direction. I didn't want to do what at that time here they used to call letras. Letras meant humanities. All the women that I knew were going in that direction. I wanted to be somewhat original. I don't know where this came from. And then I read that article. The University of Barcelona next year is going to have a new faculty and a new department that is going to call economics. And I thought, that sounds interesting. And my only reason to justify it was, it's going to help me find out the difference between capitalism and socialism. Because it was like a question I had in my mind I couldn't understand. And I thought, well, this may help. And this was as little as that that helped me decide to do economics. There were 3 women out of 70 the first year. There was only 3 of us. One of these women went to Madrid. The other one fell a little bit behind, so by the time we finished, I was the only one, but there was a second one that had joined us in our 3rd year. Mm-hmm. So there was only 2 really got the degree the first time.
How did your male classmates treat you? Were you just another student, or did you stand out for being a woman?
Well, they were very polite, very nice, but the gender relationship was very typical, very typical. I think I was that nice girl that was coming from the mountains, and she was a fairly good student. I didn't have very, very high, because some of the topics, it seemed like it was the male's field and not mine, like statistics or mathematics. But I did well in math, and that was very helpful. In economics, it was very helpful. And they were nice. You know, now when I look back, I thought that it was such a sexist environment when you think. But I was not that way at that time of the sexism of the setup.
You used a really interesting phrase, the nice girl from the mountains. If you'd come from Barcelona, do you think they'd see you differently if you had an urban?
Well, as you can imagine, I was not a very cultured person. My background was rich in many ways, but it was not cultured. I remember going to the first concert of classical music with some of my friends, and at the end of the concert, you know, when they do they give you a gift of another little piece. It was a Beethoven piece. I don't remember which one it was. And one of my friends said, Beethoven. And I remember looking at her and said, how does she know? And ever since then, you know, I kept going to the concert so that I would become familiar like she was with Beethoven's music or somebody else's music. But I was this girl from the mountains because, you know, I was a few years behind everybody in this cultural sense. And so I had to really work at it. It took me an effort. It took an effort, and including at that time, the Pyrenees Catalan mountain was very, now too, there is a difference between the accent in the Pyrenees from the accent in Barcelona. The Barcelona accent is supposed to be the fine accent, and then even more so. So I remember coming here, and I heard how my classmates were making fun of a guy who was speaking not even the mountains Catalan, but the same province Catalan, Lérida province Catalan. And they were making fun of him. And I said, oh my God, they're making fun of him. They'll make even more fun of me. From then on, I started to shift my accent. And at this point, it's like talking to different languages. I shift. The minute I hear Catalan from the mountains, I shift. And the minute I hear Catalan from Barcelona, which is the most common because I live here, I speak Catalan from Barcelona. So I think that's why it was easy for me to learn languages, because I was trilingual, Spanish, Catalan from the mountains, and Catalan from Barcelona.
And if we go from the mountains to the big city, can you describe how it felt the first time you went to New York?
To New York, that was something else. Barcelona was a big step, and even before Barcelona, I did my high school in the capital of the province. I was from Lleida. Yeah, so it was gradual. Lleida first, Barcelona second, and that was a big shift. But then, before I went to New York City, I was in Paris for a summer, where I learned French. And then I was in London for the first year after I had a fellowship in London. And I began to learn English. Well, I had started English here, but until you have a real immersion, you don't learn much. And even after 1 year, my English was not so great. So I wanted to go back, but it was hard to get a fellowship to study in London or in the UK. And so they said it will be easier if you apply for a fellowship to the US. I really didn't want to go to the US. That was 1961 or 61. And, but they said, apply for a Fulbright. And I did. And they gave it to me. So that took me to the US for a master's. Mm-hmm. First I did a master's. And then I came back here with I came back here because well, I didn't have to, but my idea was to just do a master's. Mm-hmm. But I met the person who became my husband in New York, and when I came back here, he followed me, and then we went back together. So it was not the second time. It was not a decision because I had the fellowship, but because I had married an American. But I did have the idea of following my studies, continuing with my studies. And once back in New York, I managed to do my PhD then, when we went back to the US. So how it felt, is that what you asked me?
Oh, well, the very first time you set foot in New York.
Oh, the very first time, I felt like a little ant in a huge mountain. I remember looking up those skyscrapers, feeling, oh my God, what is this? And no sun. There's not enough sun in the streets. I grew up with lots of sun, but you know New York City, and there is not that much sun in the streets because the big walls don't let the sun in. And that feeling of not having enough sun, and those huge buildings that I found somewhat inhuman. I got used to them eventually, and so that feeling of also, in addition to this, which is my physical very first reaction, then New York, of course, is so immense in terms of the human connections and the different lives that exist within the same city. I was very surprised to see so many Afro-Americans. I didn't expect it because in Europe, at least at that time, we had the idea that America meant blue eyes and blonde hair. And that was my idea. And when you get to New York City and you see Puerto Ricans, many blacks, of course, many Latin Americans in addition to Puerto Ricans, although in the early 60s, they dominated the Puerto Ricans. Later on, many Dominicans, now very many Mexicans from all over the place. But in addition, wherever you go, you meet people from all over the world. That sense of cosmopolitanism is always overwhelming. Plus, there are a tremendous number of things that you don't have time to go to. You always feel deprived in New York City because you would like to go to so many places, you can't make it. Especially later on when I had kids, I didn't have the ability to do this. You have that feeling, but it's a city that you love and at times you hate because it produces all these different reactions. Now, of course, from the distance, having lived there for so many years, I miss it, but I wouldn't want to leave it there right now.
And then when you started your PhD at Columbia, was this before or after you had your children? I started, in my first year, I didn't have children, but then I got pregnant and I took off for a few years and I went back in the early 70s. No, in 1970 I went back and I finished it in 1975. Yeah. And were your family supportive when you decided to go back? How did they feel?
My family here?
No, your husband and your children.
Oh, my husband was, yes, he was very supportive, yeah. I have no complaints. He was a student, he was a PhD student as well, so both of us survived with fellowships, loans. We managed to do that. And so we were, at this point, very much the same footing, yeah.
How was Columbia?
Columbia was difficult. I was in the Department of Economics, and it was a big shock to me because economics here in Barcelona was a fairly liberal profession. And it also, in the Anglo-Saxon Latin definitions of liberal, It was also liberal in the United States, but it was much more, it was much heavier in the sense of being immersed in orthodox economics, much more than here. You know, the tendency here in many universities is sort of like you have a politicized student body that's quite leaning towards the left, whereas in the United States it's just the opposite, and especially in departments of economics. And I was very kind of shocked by how economics defended the status quo, if you looked very carefully into what we were doing. So it was difficult for me because I found it too technified, you know, relying too much on techniques and not paying enough attention to the philosophy of the science or of the profession of economics. It's gotten much worse since then. If you talk to students now, they say, well, that was nothing, because it has become, you know, like a mathematical science almost, and I was already complaining at that time. So imagine how much it has changed. But the problem is still very similar to, I felt that it was very similar to the complaints that some students have now, was the kind of feeling that I had of, so many times I hesitated about whether I should shift to another social science. I thought about sociology, I thought about political science, but at the end I decided that I was right when I was 17 years old, that economics allows you to understand the world in a fairly deep way, and I stayed. And I'm not sorry I stayed, you know, even though I complained, and it has allowed me to understand how the world works, really, to the present time. And so I think that my decision was wise to stay and do economics at the end.
And this actually ties in a lot with your subsequent research. So I was really inspired in March in Barcelona when you were talking about women's unpaid labor. So what drove you to address these issues?
Well, first the feminist movement made me think about this, because I had not thought about gender differences to the extent that the feminist movement at the late 60s and early 70s stimulated us to think about it. And that happened when I was already working on thinking about my thesis. And I decided I really didn't want to write a thesis about women's issues. I wanted to do the same thing that the boys did. And so my thesis was about economic growth and education in Spain during the Franco period. But then when I was looking for data, I realized that there were a lot of the data that I was working with had the gender breakdown. Educational rates for women, educational rates for men at the primary level, secondary level, university level. So I collected this data by gender. I didn't put it into the thesis, the gender data, but I became very interested in it. So my first published paper had to do with the gender difference in education in Spain. And that was my first inroad into gender issues and women's issues, which was published. The article was published, and that led me to a job offer I had at the ILO in Geneva. I was already teaching at that time, and at Rutgers University I taught first. And a colleague said, you know, the ILO is looking for somebody like you who would work on rural women. And I said, I don't know anything about rural women. I've only done some work on women in Spain, but I am interested in women's issues. I went for I asked my husband, because I had 2 kids, and we don't want to go to Geneva. My husband was out of his job that following year. He said, yeah, we can go. I'm not going to be teaching, so we can go. We went, and I went for an interview, and they offered me the job. And that opened up a completely different area of research, because it was, I was to be coordinator of a program on rural women that the ILO had set up. That was in 1978. It was one of the first at the UN level. It was one of the first programs that was focusing on these issues. And there had already been before me one more person, Ingrid Palmer, who lives in, used to live, went from Geneva to Brighton, England, but she was Australian. And so I was the second person that was in command of the program. And I arrived there, you know, and do work on rural women all over the world. I didn't know anything about developing countries. I didn't know anything about women in developing countries, and rural women even less. So the first thing I had to do was to start reading. There was nothing in economics, in economic journals or economic books, except for, there was not an exception yet. There was an exception. There was Esther Busrup's book, Women's Role in Economic Development. There was an eye-opening. She was a Danish economist who had worked in the UN, and at the end of her UN career wrote that book, Women's Role in Economic Development. That was wonderful. But there was very little else in economics. So I had to start reading about rural women all over the world. The ILO had already paid for some studies in different areas of the world, different countries. And so that was extremely useful. And I started to read that. Most of that was not economics strictly. It came from anthropologists, from sociologists, a little bit, but not much political scientists, mostly anthropology and sociology. So that made me much more interdisciplinarian, because the background I had was about labor markets. My specialty was labor markets and development. And so all the readings I had done in graduate school had nothing about rural women in developing countries. They didn't even ask the question of, do women do different in development? Esther Busrup did. Her thesis was that development, in quotes, you know, development as it had happened during colonial times all the way to the late 1970s, had very different effects on men and women. And that was revolutionary, because not in my courses on development, nobody was ever asking a question whether the development had affected men and women differently. Busrup showed us for Africa, Latin America, and Asia that it was different. And so that was very helpful based on Busrup, to expand the area of research. And of course I was in a privileged position because the ILO had some money to do studies in different parts of the world. And we were getting studies from, I remember one from Bangladesh that was extremely interesting, that touched the question of seclusion. And I remember it was a shock to me that one of the questions that the sociologist asked was asking women, what would you like your daughter to be when she grows up? And many of them said, I would like her to be secluded. And it was such a shock that women would say that. And of course then you have to understand why. And one of the answers to this puzzling answer was that secluded women were from middle class and upper class. And the women that did work in the fields were poor women. They didn't want their daughters to be poor. So one symbol for them was seclusion. So it takes a while to get to these answers. And there were studies that were just as interesting as that. Remember, also there was one about Papua New Guinea that had part of the study dealt with indigenous women, some about Africa, much fewer than Latin America. But of course that job was an eye-opening that had many important repercussions on what I did afterwards, because also at the ILO, what I started to do was to do what eventually I called the accounting for women's work. And that came from a visit in a study that the ILO paid for Morocco. I had to go to evaluate whether the project that had been sent to us was worth, doing and funding. And I remember I did my homework to go to Morocco, and I looked at statistics, and it said women's labor force participation rate 8%, 9%. Men's labor force participation rate 79%, 75%. Okay, that was in my mind. We went to Morocco, And we ended up in a hotel in a place called Szechuan, which is a mountain resort in northern Morocco, beautiful town. And we got up in the morning, and it was quite early, and the town was very busy, but mostly what you would see were lots of women carrying all kinds of things. It was like an outhouse of women, sometimes with their children. One of them was carrying a basket on her head to take it to the oven, the village oven. Others were bringing the bread back to their homes. Others were carrying other things. They were going shopping, and many of them, as we saw some, one of the women or two of them were in a sort of like a little river. Barranco is in Spanish. It's like what is it in English? It doesn't matter. It's a little river where they were washing the clothes, and one of them had her feet, and it was November. It was not very cold, but it wasn't hot either. She was washing with her feet in there. So it was hard work, all of these women, sometimes with their kids. They were doing 2 or 3 jobs at the same time. And then we went back into the village. We saw men. They were sitting in front of the shops because it's a tourist shop, and it was the men who were selling. But it was not a touristic region, a touristic season. November, there were no tourists. So, and the men were sitting, chatting, and I thought there is something wrong with the statistics I have in my head. Women's labor force participation rate, it seemed to be, 90%. And men's labor force participation rate, yes, but they were unemployed. They were not doing really much. So I went back to the ILO and I told my colleagues, because I was in a program that was dealing with labor force statistics. And the first opportunity I had, I said, listen, colleagues, there is something wrong with the statistics that we manage. Of course, these statistics come from each country, and the ILO compiles them at the international level. But I thought something was wrong with the statistics because it doesn't reflect reality. So from then on, that became a very important project for me, to deal with what I call the accounting for women's work. It was mostly because women were doing unpaid work. And unpaid work did not count in national statistics. It still doesn't in many countries' statistics, because it doesn't go through the market. The way we define national income or gross national product statistics is that we only account for paid work work that goes through the market. Mm-hmm. And that becomes part of GNP, or it becomes part of labor force statistics. So from then on, it has become also a feminist project, not just mine, to show that those statistics needed correction. And of course, at the official level, they have not been totally corrected, but there's been many effort in many countries that show, how much is unpaid work, how much is the work that does not go through the market. And it's been many years now, and many countries have even what is called satellite accounts that take into consideration unpaid work. Because at the very official international level, it became official in preparation for the Beijing conference in 1995, because UNDP, which it was a very nice project on the part of UNDP, they thought that their preparation for that year's Human Development Report should be on this topic in preparation for the Beijing conference. And I was invited to the committee that prepared a report for the Beijing conference. Mm-hmm. And so the person that was, it had to be a man, the person that was heading the committee was Amartya Sen. Luckily, he was a wonderful man, Amartya Sen, a Nobel Prize from India. And so there was background work, there were several what they call background papers to prepare the final report, and those papers were based on 31 countries, north and south, estimating how much it was in each country, and the proportion of unpaid work, and what proportion to GNP, how much of it was unpaid, how much of it was paid. And basically each country, although there were many differences by country, each country, the study on each of these countries showed the same, that the proportion of unpaid work represented, well, if we take all of them into consideration, the range was between 25% and 45% of GNP. And so it was a lot. And I remember Marchesen, when we were preparing that, and he saw these statistics, he said, you know, they're not going to believe us. They won't believe that there's such a high proportion, that unpaid work represents such a high proportion of GNP, of total in GNP, if we take into consideration unpaid work. And, but you know, we had 31 countries statistics in a study, and eventually it was published, and eventually it was very influential in developing the kind of statistics that the Human Development Report incorporated, and they have been used ever since. In this sense, UNDP, we should, you know, really thank UNDP that it developed, it dedicated that effort in preparation for the Beijing conference, because from then on, I remember one of the concerns was at the World Bank, because there was some shall I say, rivalry between the World Bank and UNDP on developing statistics. The World Bank always sort of thinking that UNDP perhaps was too soft on some human or social matters. The concern was they will tell us that we are not rigorous enough with numbers. And we said, well, we have this, so we can show that these studies have been done, and then they can be improved in the following years. So this was done, and since then, since that year, the Human Development Report has a very good series of gender development index. I mean, they are not perfect, and there's been lots of literature developed after that on how these statistics could be improved. It's still continuing now, but it was a real turning point.
And if you look at because you've done this tremendous work, if you look at where you are now in your career, how does that compare to where you saw yourself when you started your degree in Barcelona?
Oh, I never thought I would do what I've done, because first of all, I wasn't thinking international at that point, but I did take in my last year a course on international development, the international economics it was called, and I was very interested. I think that course really influenced me, and although I did not expect that I would actually live outside, that I would be in the US for 43 years, well, US or other countries, I did not expect that, but I was interested already then in international issues. So in this sense, it was similar. But of course, the experience that you gain over the years changes many things.
Do you feel you had to fight harder because you're a woman?
Yes. When I got to the ILO and I proposed this change, not change in the statistics, I said we have to do something about it. Nobody wanted to discuss it. They thought I was crazy. No, not crazy, but they thought I was naive. I mean, what do you want to measure? What do you want to measure about women's work? You know, the number of hours you do sex? One of them said. Really? One of the assistants, one of the attendants. This person, though, an economist, has become a real ally, became a real ally. But that was a stupid reaction of his at that moment, not very well thought out, but and eventually he changed. But yeah, it was difficult. And of course, when you go through different departments in universities, you always have to fight a little harder because you're a woman. When you are young, you don't even dare to raise your hand. And then you have to struggle, especially me, who came from the Pyrenees Mountains and was not very used to raise my hand.
And the youngest of 6 children.
Yes, and I was very shy. And it was a tremendous struggle. There are men who are shy as well. So I can speak about my struggle with it. Why I became a college professor, it was not meant to be, it seemed. But I became a college professor because it was easier to have free time to take care of my children, because the schedule of a college professor can be very flexible. You can teach in the morning, you can teach in the afternoon, and you can combine the different hours. So that's why I did that. I didn't want to do a 9-to-5 job. So that's why I did that, not because I thought I was perfect to do that by any means, because the fear of speaking in public at first was really, I still remember my first class. It was terrible. I had long notes, and I finished them in half an hour because I was going so fast that I didn't have a sense of, it was a disaster, the first class, and then you learn.
Is there anything you would have done differently looking back on your career?
I would fight, I would get more angry. I was very polite all the time. I think I would learn to be angry and express the anger that you do feel inside, but you don't express it.
And then as a final parting question, since we're a young academy, is there a particular message you'd like to give the next generation of young scientists and academics?
Well, I think to continue the work that we have begun. I think we are lucky that we've gone through several decades of tremendously important change for women. And to continue that work, not let it go, because I sometimes think that we're going backwards. So I would say don't forget the struggle that we went through at many different levels, because sometimes when I read some of the stuff that's being written now, I thought, what is the meaning of this? Of course, one has different points of view. I don't want to criticize it, but I do think that in terms of struggling and looking ahead about changing the world wherever the world is not in good shape, that feminism became a little too complacent during I would say from the late 80s on, that we moved to, the influence of postmodernism, which is interesting in many ways, but in other ways it has been a way of not talking about, or not connecting feminism to social issues and political issues enough. And now I think we are finally looking, and some of the younger women see that that has been a problem, and so that we should go back and talk about social issues more, and connecting representation with how does Nancy Fraser calls it? I'm not remembering what she does. That meaning the connecting the ideas that came from postmodernism with those of us in economics are very interested, that had to do with the material, with everyday social struggle of making society a better society, more equal society, with the problems we have about inequality now and the tensions around the world. I think the feminism should turn more into dealing with social issues and change the world. But that was already in Beijing. I remember a woman who said, women have gone from asking the question, from complaining, from feeling victims, to being those who think that they will change the world. But we haven't done enough of that. And so I think we should go. And I don't know who said that, but I always remembered. It was a wonderful phrase. And instead of doing that, since the late 80s until recently, we haven't really been concerned enough about changing the world.
Powerful words. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to interview you. And thank you very much for listening.